Okay, guys, so today we are going to study learner's error analysis. And to cover this part of applied linguistics, we are going to do just one chapter, and that is the study of second language acquisition by Rod Ellis. And we are going to do a chapter from this book, okay? The name of the book is The Study of Second Language Acquisition, and it is by um, Ellis. And um, to get to know about errors and error analysis, we are going to cover this chapter only as a part of applied linguistics. Okay. So first of all, we need to look at some of the terms that might be important to study error analysis. Now, firstly, um, errors are of two kinds, basically. Okay. There are some errors that are called as errors of comprehension, and then there are some errors that are called as errors of production, right? The work in the field of applied linguistics, as far as error analysis is concerned, is mostly done with learners making errors in production. Okay. Now, by comprehension, error of comprehension, we mean that when the learners misunderstand something in the second language. Okay. um, this can be that they have heard something incorrectly, or they have understood or they have interpreted something incorrectly. Okay. And the second kind of error are the errors of production. That is when they are producing the language in the form of speech or in the form of writing, right? So we already know that language can be produced, or language is available to be seen through the production of learners, is through their speaking and writing. Okay. Also reading, right? Now what happens is that the errors of production can be analyzed. Okay. Whereas the errors of comprehension um, can be analyzed, but it is difficult because comprehension is actually a cognitive process, right? So it sometimes becomes difficult to analyze the process of understanding that is going on in the minds of the learners, right? So in this short introductory discussion, one thing is very evident, that when we are referring to errors, we are referring to those learners who are learning English or any language as a second language. And as I told you, in our context, especially here, while we were also doing the methodologies, I told you when we talk in our context, in Pakistani context, that means learning of English as a second language. So when we are talking about errors and error analysis, we would be looking at the language that is produced by learners who are learning English as a second language. Okay. So we would not be looking at the comprehension errors, of course, which is about misunderstanding the sentence, or hearing something incorrectly, or not processing the information correctly. So we would be looking at the errors of production. Okay. And much of the research in the field of applied linguistics, specifically for error analysis, is conducted through collecting written samples of the learners, right? Now, when we say that error analysis in applied linguistics is related to errors, of second language learners, um, do we mean that other people do not commit errors, or native speakers are just perfect in the production of the language? And what about children who keep on committing errors even while learning the first language or the mother tongue? Okay, so L2 learners are not alone in making errors, right? Um, Children also make errors, but then those are called as transition forms. That is, one day they'll automatically correct themselves, or their errors are taken as natural. Every child learning a particular language would make certain errors, and that those errors are not needed to be corrected. In other words, those would be corrected by the child at some stage of language learning. For instance, we have observed that uh, children mispronounce a number of words because they are unable to pronounce certain phonemes correctly. And we do not mind, rather, we enjoy those errors that are made by them. So, because we believe that that's a transitional forms, and it is not taken really seriously, and those are oftentimes not corrected because we are sure that that's a part of their language acquisition, and they will find out the correct form and they'll correct themselves at some stage of this process. Whereas there are adult native speakers who also make errors, right? And their errors are called as slip of the tongue or slip of the pen, and those are not taken seriously or as errors, and oftentimes are again not corrected even, right? But um, when it comes to second language learning, we need to, as teachers or as applied linguists, we need to analyze those errors, okay? Because those are called as unwanted forms by Coda. And Coda happens to be the person who has worked much in the field of error analysis, okay? And he is amongst the pioneers in this field, right? Now, the study of these errors that are committed by second language learners are analyzed through error analysis, okay? So error analysis is basically an analytical process, a methodology, you can say, through which we can find errors, the description, how to explain those errors. And finally, as I told you, that applied linguistics comes with, solving issues in second language teaching and learning. Okay, it addresses those issues. That is why error analysis is a part of applied linguistics. So it becomes sometimes really important for the teachers to find out the sources of those errors, to analyze those errors, to describe, to categorize, and to why is it important? Because it is important to help the students. It's just not correcting the students, but it is helping the students to um, enable them to avoid these errors. Okay, so error analysis is basically the study of errors, right? And this is supplanted by contrastive analysis. Okay, so contrastive analysis is as again a method, but it helps in error analysis, right? through contrastive analysis, we can find few kinds of errors. And as I defined contrastive analysis in the previous lectures while we were doing language teaching methodologies, contrastive analysis is also conducted by the teacher or applied linguist while they are trying to compare and contrast the first language and the target language of the learners. And it is believed that the differences in the two languages result in errors. Okay, so if the languages are similar, for example, if the first language and the target language are European languages, then the chances are that it would be easier for the learners to learn and the chances of errors would be less, right? And so basically, contrastive analysis is related to interference in language habit transfer when a learner tries to converse in the second language, and he keeps falling back on his first language for help, for translation, for structures. So there is a perpetual interference from the first language, and contrastive analysis actually finds those areas of interference, and also the differences and the similarities, right? Because if the languages are similar, it would be easier for the learners to learn the second language, right? And if, for instance, if I give you an example of contrastive analysis, um, in some languages, certain phonemes might be absent, and in some languages, there are some extra phonemes that the learner has never learned to pronounce during the process of language acquisition, right? So it can so happen that the learner is unable to pronounce those particular phonemes, right? For instance, in our local languages, sometimes the her sound is not present. So and per sound is not present. So it becomes difficult for the second language learners to pronounce those sounds in English language. In Arabic, I think per sound is not present. So instead of barking, they pronounce barking because they have never experienced the pronunciation of per sound. So with little efforts on the part of the teacher, the students might be able to pronounce those sounds also. So contrastive analysis is just not related to pronunciation of phonemes and phonology, but if two languages have similar structures, then it would be easier for the learners. And when the structures are not similar, sometimes the grammar isn't similar. Oftentimes it is not similar as far as parts of speech are concerned. And sometimes the tenses as well, feminine, masculine also. So the learners with these differences between L1 and L2, or mother tongue and the target language, will face difficulties in learning the differences, okay, what they have not experienced in the process of language acquisition, right? So what is basically error analysis? Error analysis is a methodology for investigating learner, language, and specifically L2 learning or L2 acquisition, right? So when we talk about errors, we would be doing these errors in some detail, but what might be some of the very common errors are wrong pronunciation, misuse or omission of articles, misspellings, non-English constructions, wrong use of sentences. And we have examples of all of these while we are, checking students' answer sheets. And those can be taken as samples as well, right? Now, um, let's talk about why error analysis might be uh, important, or why should error analysis be done, right? Now, error analysis should be done because it provides teachers with information about how much the learner has learned, okay? How much time the learner is taking, and how much language, or English language specifically for now, has he learned. How language was learned, the teacher gets to know the process. And error analysis, um, could be a device through which the learner discovered the rules of the target language, right? So errors are important, and by important, I do not say that the teacher should encourage them, but errors are such that they would be committed in the process of language learning. But these errors are significant because they provide, through their analysis, they provide teacher with the information of how much the learner has learned the language, and what is the process going on, how is the learner learning the language. And these errors can act as device also through which the learner himself discovers the rules of the target language, right? So um, error analysis, therefore, whatever discussion we have done till now, we can fairly and easily conclude that error analysts are usually concerned with language teaching, and error analysis is important to improve pedagogy, right? Therefore, because it's a part of language teaching and it's a part of pedagogy, so it's an important part of applied linguistics, the core part of applied linguistics. If you have seen my other videos on applied linguistics, we have discussed why applied linguistics is all about language teaching, and how initially applied linguistics was only about language teaching, and later on, so many other fields got added and became subfields of applied linguistics. But initially, and the core part of applied linguistics is language teaching and language pedagogy. So when we say that error analysis aims at improving pedagogy, and it's error, the core concern, or the main or the basic concern of error analysts is language teaching. In other words, we are saying that error analysis is an integral, core, main, basic part of applied linguistics. Um, so, as I told you, that Corda happens to be the pioneer of error analysis. He has given certain steps, because I told you that error analysis is a methodology. It's a methodology to find out a number of things related to error. It's just not, finding out the errors, but it has a lot to do with the kinds of errors, the description of errors, explanation of errors, and measures and means to correct those errors. So Corder in 1974, he suggested some of the steps for error analysis research, right? So here are some of the steps which we are going to look at in detail. So the first thing is you need to collect samples of language learning, or some learner sample, right? And then it's identification of errors. What kind of errors are those, and whether in the first place those are errors or those are not errors. Then there is a description of errors, and then there is step explanation of errors, and then finally we are going to evaluate those errors. So now let's talk about how can we collect the samples, and what are the different kinds of samples according to their sizes, and how can these help us. So I hope you have studied research and you know the difference between population and sample. Um, for now, while we are talking about analysis, I would just like to tell you that sample is taken from the population. Okay, sample in, includes people or specimen which become directly become a part of your research, right? You gather information from the sample and the results are applied on the population, okay? Because population is huge, and all people or everything that is part of the population cannot participate in the research, right? So what happens is you conduct your research with a sample, you collect information, you collect data from the sample, analyze, and by the end of the research, you come up with certain results. So those results, and sometimes those results are in the form of some solutions also. So those results in the solution can be applied to the whole population, because um, there are some authentic and scientific sampling techniques also. Right now, since this is not a research class, so I'm not going into details of sampling and sampling techniques. But just for now, just you need to understand the samples, okay? From where you will get your data. And as we are doing error analysis, so here you will get your data related to the errors from the sample. And this sample should consist of second language learners production, language production. So that can be, I told you, it can be in the form of writing, and much of the time it's in the form of writing. You collect their writings and then you analyze the writings for errors, and then you analyze those errors, and then through these steps you reach some solution how those errors can be avoided in your classrooms. Now let's talk about okay, let's talk about the kind of samples. Now, in error analysis, the samples are differentiated on the basis of their size. There can be massive samples, and in massive samples, there can be several samples, and sometimes this covers the entire population. Okay, if you have, if you are teaching two classes, for instance, or two sections of the same semester, and you involve everyone, so everyone becomes a part of your sample. So that's a massive sample. You have taken everyone from the two classes that you're teaching. You have taken the entire population, and you get almost 100 to 100, 100 to 110 sample writings. Other than that, there can be some specific sample. By specific sample, we mean that one sample of language use. That is, you have asked the students, or you have prepared a test which would make the students to use one particular part of the language. For instance, you have given them an exercise on tenses. Okay, just to check what kind of errors they can make in terms of tenses in English, right? Some other time you check for errors in prepositions. So you are working on a sample of single language use, one sample of language use. Other than that, you can also take incidental sample, that is one sample of language by one learner, right? So you can work with one learner and his errors, um, areas where he commits those errors. So that becomes incidental sample, that is you're working with, a very small kind of a sample, maybe just one sample of language by one learner only. So it is not really important in the research of error analysis that you have to work with massive samples. Basically, error analysis is problem solving, right? So if you have 10 students, if you have 5 students, or even if you have one student, the rest of the class is performing well, but you have problem with some of the students, so you are not going to analyze the errors of all the students, but you are going to analyze the errors where there are problems in your class, or where there are students in the class whose errors needs to be diagnosed and whose errors needs to be corrected. So according to your classroom situation and context, you're going to take the sample. Okay. Other than that, there are some factors that can impact the errors that learners make. Sometimes we have, personally experienced it as well, that students commit errors in speaking but not in writing, right? Because speaking is one process, writing is another process. Chances are that students who are not good at speaking would not be good at writing, but this doesn't happen to be true all the time. Sometimes the students are committing errors in speaking because maybe they are tensed, they are nervous in front of the teacher or in front of the class. But when it comes to writing, when they are on their own, when they have their own space, they may feel more confident, so they do not commit errors in writing, right? um, Other than the physical situation, who they are talking to and whom they are writing, and for whom they are writing, and what's on their mind, who's going to check that, there are a number of contextual features, factors, I would say. But other than that, speaking and writing are two different processes. Okay. Other factors, as I told you while I was discussing contrastive analysis, is the difference in L1, right? And we can check more of these factors from uh, this table, 2.1, right? So the difference in errors by different learners can be because of medium, as I told you that they are speaking or they are writing. Then genre difference, whether the students are just doing the conversation, they are giving a lecture, they are writing an essay, or they are writing a letter, right? For instance, many of us have rote learned some of the applications. And when it comes to leave applications, we write some flawless specimens of English language. We don't commit any errors because it's a matter of memorization and it's coming from the memory. But when it comes to writing an essay, the same student who wrote a flawless application comes with an essay which is full of errors, right? So when the genre changes, genre becomes one of the factors, right? And then the third one is related to the content. Um, the topic is difficult for the students to talk about or to write, and sometimes the topic is easy for the student, or the student is not interested in the topic that he has been asked to write on, right? So these are some of the language related factors which can affect the data that is collected, right? For error analysis. Now, there are other factors related to the learners. Okay. So the level of learners can vary. They can be from the elementary level, intermediate, or advanced level. Again, the mother tongue, the difference in the mother tongue while we were doing contrastive analysis. If one student's mother tongue is closer or similar to the target language than the mother tongue of the other student, so contrastive analysis tells us that it would be easier, and the student whose language or mother tongue is similar to the target language, chances are that he would commit lesser errors than the other student whose language is entirely different from the target language, right? And language learning experience, this may be classroom or naturalistic or a mixture of the two. Um, the person might be more fluent while he's outside the classroom. He's in a stress-free environment. He's talking to his friends. Then inside the classroom, where you know maybe the physical environment is really stressful. It's really competitive. He's uncomfortable. So there are so many factors that can impact the data collection or the making of errors or the analysis of errors. So while we are collecting error sample, I mean, we are collecting data from the sample about the errors, we need to consider these factors as well, because they would impact the final results, right? So we will also talk about homogeneous sample some other time, but we would see how can we reduce the influence or the impact of these factors on the data that we are collecting, right? Other than that, other than these factors, it also, the quality of data also depends on the manner of data collection, right? Whether we have collected spontaneous data, right, as produced by the students, okay. Spontaneous means, they whatever they have to say on the spot. We have not given them any topic. We are just recording their natural conversation inside the classrooms or outside the classroom. So that's kind of a spontaneous and natural kind of a data. The other kind of data that we can work with is through elicitation, right? um, Now, elicitation data can be clinical elicitation. Elicitation means that you actually ask the students to do something for you so that you can collect the data. So there can be clinical elicitation, which can be through interviews or composition writing. Okay, so you tell your students you're going to conduct the interviews, and you're going to record that for your research, or you can collect. You can ask them to write composition, and then you can collect the data. This comes in when you actually elicit the data, you plan to collect the data, and that's not spontaneous. And then there are experimental kind of elicitation, where you may use special instruments to collect the data. Okay, maybe you're taking down notes, or you might be using the recorders, or you can be doing things in steps, which is called as experimental kind of data, where you would be using special instruments, and the data collection would be very much planned and would be conducted through special instruments according to the requirement of your research. Okay, more factors are the period of data collection. There are two kinds of time periods as far as data collection is concerned, just not for error analysis, but for research of any kind. One is the cross-sectional data collection, and the other is, longitudinal data collection. So cross-sectional data collection is a data collection at a single point in time. Okay, when you just go inside the classroom and you get the data just at that particular time, right? You don't go for data collection to the data collection site again and again, whatever the site is. Much of the time, error analysis data collection sites are the classrooms, or language teaching and learning places. So cross-sectional data collection refers to the time when you collect the data in single point in time. You do not visit the site again and again, but you just go and collect the data. Longitudinal data collection is the collection at successive points over a period of time, right? You give data collection a lot of time, and that is called as longitudinal data collection, or longitudinal study we also call. So you go several times, maybe you're looking at the improvement also, or maybe you are after several kinds of errors that are committed at different points in time through different means that you are using for collecting data. So that is called as longitudinal data collection or longitudinal study. Whereas, again, I repeat that the other kind is cross-sectional, where you collect data in single point in time. You don't go again and again, but you just collect data, whatever is available at that time. As I told you in the beginning of the lecture also, that much of the research in this error analysis is on production errors. And in production errors, few studies are on learner speech, and most of the studies are on writing errors that are collected through composition writing and through translations as well. So we are done with just one of the stages of data collection, which is, sampling of the data. And in the next lecture, we will be looking at the identification of errors. Okay. And then further, we would be doing the description and explanation, and finally the evaluation. So this is all for today. I'll see you with the other steps in the next lecture.